Look, guys, on the channel, we recently posted a video of a sound that was recorded by a police officer over in the United States in 1981, right? So he was there during the recordings with a radio, an amateur radio talking and all that. And suddenly the unidentified flying object they were spotting made a noise, a buzzing sound, and it ended up being recorded. And we put it in a video here on the channel. If you haven't watched it, go check it out later. So there are several cases that have already happened in other parts of the world. The most well-known case that happened in Europe, for example, was the Javier Bosque case, which happened in 1972, with a seminarian named Javier Bosque, and he filmed it. In fact, he recorded on his tape recorder a sound that the radio was making after an unidentified flying object entered his room. He was a seminarian, so he was there studying. He studied. At night, that ball of light came in and it shone a beam of light that hit the radio. The radio recorder he had was moving like this, and then he turned on the recorder and started recording a different kind of static that came out. Actually, we don't know if it was the unidentified flying object that produced that sound, or if it was because of the interference it caused in the radio, in the equipment there. It could have been that too, and not the sound itself. So, since there are several cases around the world about unidentified flying object recordings, I decided to put together a compilation of Brazilian cases here. So this live stream is a bit instructive, also educational, let's say, within this area. Because when we published that audio from the United States from 1981, many people in the comments were saying, oh, but UFOs aren't silent. So that's fake, right? People started to question, to doubt. But what happens? Anyone who's been into ufology for a long time knows that in some cases, sometimes there's sound from the object, especially when it's closer and all, but in most cases, there's no sound. It's completely silent, right? That actually gives even more credibility, let's say, to the phenomenon. But every now and then, there are some UFOs that produce some kind of noise, a buzzing sound, right? So there's that. And then we have to separate things. Here, there are UFOs that do make sounds, yes, and there are UFOs that maybe its electromagnetic field or some technology it has interferes with the electronic devices, right? So the television, then you get static on the television radio, right? This could happen with police car radios or regular radios that people are listening to. Nowadays, people hardly listen to the radio anymore, but in the past, this happened a lot. So there are these two things. Either the unidentified flying object is producing sound, or it's interfering with our equipment and creating some kind of unusual sound, right? Kind of strange. So there are these two things. In Brazil, we have a case involving sound. I even looked for that tape, but I don't think it's here at my house because we have material spread out in other places too. And I have a tape with the sound from a case that happened in Maranhão many years ago, right? But when I find the tape, I'll see if I can make a video to share it with you. But like here in Brazil, there aren't really any reports of sounds from these objects that have been recorded like that. At least I knew about this one from Maranhão. I heard that the Brazilian Air Force also obtained some things. This was in the past, back in the time of Sioane, the Center for Investigation of Unidentified Aerial Objects. Major Zane, right, did he ever mention anything? I actually asked him back when I was at his apartment in December of '97. So there are definitely some things for sure recorded somewhere, hidden away, right? But unfortunately, we don't have access to those military audio materials. But there are the cases that remained that were being recorded by the pioneering ufologists, and some more in modern times. where the case is there, the unidentified flying object made a sound. There was a buzzing like a bee. There was a sewing machine motor. It sounded like an electric motor. It sounded like the noise of a refrigerator, right? So there are many different types of sounds that have already been heard by witnesses. So to start, I'm going to do something more or less chronological, just so we can get an idea that the fact that there are cases of UFOs with sound is not that recent. Let's put it this way. There are old cases. So in the Brazilian Society for Flying Saucer Research Bulletin, which is from the Brazilian Society for Flying Saucer Research, this organization from Rio de Janeiro, which was presided over by Walter Biller, right, who was a researcher that investigated numerous cases. In one of the bulletins from the 1950s, what did I find? Here, he has a section where he compiles several cases that happened in 1957 and 1958, and he makes a little note here. Look, I even highlighted it here in yellow, and below I highlighted the cases. Just so we have an idea, I'll read it to you. It says here, the movement of flying saucers is silent. Oh, in most cases, however, they found the following items A and B, right? Item A says a noise in 6 cases. So there are cases 10, 40, 115, 126, 128B, 128C, and in item B, a hiss, a kind of whistle. In 2 cases, it was noticed by people who were very close to the flying saucer. So case 11 and case 33. I took the tables. These here are the little tables from Walter Buller's bulletin. These cases, case 10, for example, it happened on June 7, 1958 in Florianopolis, Santa Catarina. So this is one of the cases. So case 40 is a case that happened in Itaipava in Sao Paulo in November 1957, and this noise was also heard. Case 115 was in Matutina in Minas Gerais, Matutina, Minas Gerais on August 21st. Actually, November 21st, 1957. Another case that also happened in Minas Gerais, case 126 in Sabinópolis, Minas Gerais, on October 22nd, 1958, and cases 128B and 128C happened in Brejauva and in Bocaiúva, all in Minas Gerais, and on the date of let's see here, actually, in 1958, there isn't a specific date. So Brejauva and Bocaiúva in Minas Gerais in 1958. Well, just to show that in the 1950s, we had a lot of sightings, right? And every now and then, the unidentified flying object would make some kind of noise. In 1956, so I also picked out a case from their bulletin, which has the witness, Mrs. Clélia. This one here, look, this is Mrs. Clélia from the Isbedvi bulletin. And then it brings up the case where she heard this noise. Obviously, I'm not going to give too many details about the case, but this was an abduction that happened in Rio de Janeiro with this lady. The witness, Clélia TR, right? We don't have her last name, was a housewife, mother of 2 daughters. And at the time of the incident, she was 22 years old. So at the time she experienced it, when they were abducted and all, she was 22 years old. It happened at Saco de São Francisco Beach, which is an extension of Caraí and Cândido do Rio beaches, located in the city of Niterói in the state of Rio de Janeiro. And the event happened on the 10th or 11th, right? They're not really sure if it was the 10th or the 11th of September, 1956. And it lasted until 11 o'clock, from 11 o'clock until about 4:30 post-meridium approximately. In other words, it was quite a long time there. There was the sighting and then there was the abduction. So basically, she was taken inside the craft, right? She went through some experiences there, right? In fact, regression hypnosis was done. In this case, anytime I can tell you this case in detail because it's very complete here. Look, inside the circular room, she was taken to a circular room, right? So there are a lot of details, there are ideas. There's also transcribed hypnosis about this case, but regarding the sound of the object, I highlighted here in a part of the report that says this. It was around 11 o'clock and she got worried when she realized she still had to prepare lunch for her daughters. One was 1.5 years old and the other was 3 years old. At that moment, her attention was drawn to a slight noise. Noise, right? Sometimes there are UFOs that make that deafening noise, right? That makes people feel uncomfortable. But it was a slight noise coming from the direction of the sea, right? She associated the noise with a bright spot, right? She saw a luminous object and associated the sound with that object and that object. It started, this luminous object started to descend over the sea and the noise increased enormously to the point that she put her hands over her ears to protect them, right? Because then it kept getting louder and louder and she got worried, put her hands over her ears. She noticed the same gesture in a young man who was sitting on the beach. The swimmers who were previously in the sea had left, right? And afraid of the noisy object that was approaching and fearful, they gathered in small groups. Because like a lot of people who were on the beach saw this object and all, and the object kept getting closer. And then later, when she realizes it, a lot of time had already passed and everything. And then the people were no longer there. And then she saw a guy also lying in a certain spot there where she also woke up kind of disoriented. And when they did the hypnosis in her case, they found out that there was an abduction with her and with that guy who was lying there, right? And she had the memory lapse, that missing time, you know, that she couldn't remember what it was. And then sometime later, she ended up doing a hypnosis session with Professor Silvio Lago, who was from Rio. He also helped Mrs. Irene Granke a lot, right? And the researchers from Rio, Walter Williams, Zaire Beatties, and so on. And then during that hypnosis, it was confirmed that Clélia had been abducted, right? That young woman over there. Well, then, so a case from 1956 with this thing about hearing a noise, right? Produced by the unidentified flying object, by that unidentified flying object, which later approached the beach. It ended up taking them, right? And that's how the case happened. Well, I'm going to skip about 10 years ahead now, right? That case was in 56 to 1960s. If you take 1966, there was also an interesting case that happened in Mascarenas, in the locality of Mascarenas, on the 5th, let's see here, May 5th, 1966. There were 4 industrialists who were hunting in that region there in Mascarenas. They were hunting Mareco, that one that looks like a duck. And they saw an object, right? About 1,000 meters high, right? It was about 1 kilometer up in the air. And it was also making a strange noise, right? And according to them, this object also had a strange trail. It left a luminous trail. Just like there aren't many details about this case, we don't know if it could be an unidentified flying object. It was actually classified as an unidentified flying object, but it could have been a bolide, something like that, right? Suddenly he was passing by and heard this noise because sometimes bolides, meteors, and such can produce some kind of noise. Well, let's go to 1967. I also have 4 cases here that reported noise, and one of them is from 1967, which happened in the Serra da Mantiqueira on the Rio de Janeiro side around 1:30 in the morning. It says here that a citizen named Geraldo Baqueiro, who was a federal employee, he observed an object coming from behind a mountain range, right? So an unidentified flying object came from behind a mountain range. It stopped about 30 meters from his car. He was inside the car and he saw through a kind of windshield of that unidentified flying object, that flying saucer. He saw 5 people who had cat-like faces, according to his description. So they were anthropomorphic, human bodies with cat faces. And then he mentions that the object took off with a strong gust of wind and a deafening buzz. The source of this information is a report from Guane, which was a group from Itajuba, Minas Gerais. And this case was presented at the second Brazilian colloquium on flying saucers, which took place in Sao Paulo on November 3rd and 4th, 1967. The case is said to have involved the sighting of beings and an object with a buzzing sound on June 7th, 1967. It's interesting that this case from Serra da Mantiqueira is very similar to a case I described in my book, Ancient Aliens of Brazil, which is a case involving a being with a cat-like face. Would it be this little being here with a cat-like face? But this case happened in 1946 over there in Guarujá on the coast of Sao Paulo. I know of other cases that have already happened, for example, in Iporanga in 96, where the witness even reported the same thing that Geraldo Baqueiro said, that it was a disc and it had a kind of glass, like a transparent windshield. And he looked inside and saw 2 beings with cat-like faces inside that unidentified flying object. But this specific one from 67, where it made a buzzing sound as it left, another case was described in the GOAN reports, which happened on July 5th, 1967 in Pelotas in Rio Grande do Sul. It says here that in the early morning hours, a fireball was seen, a flying object in the shape of a fireball with clear outlines, leaving a trail of sparks and a slight hissing sound. The source of this information is the Diário Popular of Pelotas in its July 6, 1967 edition. So another case that happened in 67, also in Itajuba, Minas Gerais, on August 3, 1967, it was reported that an object similar to a metallic bowl was observed, a metallic bowl rising. It was rising with a loud noise, and as it was going up, it was making this sound, a noise, a loud noise. At a distance of about 200 meters from the witnesses, other residents of the Itajuba area also observed the same object. The source is the same as Joanio's, the report that was presented at the second Brazilian colloquium on flying saucers. The other case occurred 6 days after this one in Minas Gerais, in the same city of Itajuba. In other words, it seems there was an unidentified flying object wave happening there. That's why there were several cases in Itajuba in the month of August. And this one happened on August 9th, 1967. At 1 o'clock in the morning, an object shaped like Saturn was seen over the city, very similar to the one that Almiro Barahona photographed on Trinidad Island in 1958. But this one is a case from 1967 in the city of Itajuba, Minas Gerais. So it was a Saturn-shaped object with that halo around it. And it says here that the dogs in the neighborhood became very restless while the object was nearby. And a noise was heard, like a hissing sound. Also, this information is from GOAN's report. This organization from Minas Gerais, which no longer exists, but in the past did very serious work cataloging cases of unidentified flying objects. Well, I'll skip to the next year, 68, and I'll talk here. A case, for example, from May 30th, 68, that happened in Canoas, Rio Grande do Sul, also the city of Canoas, between around 4:30 post-meridium and 5 o'clock post-meridium in the afternoon. A rounded shaped object was seen, but it was a bit flattened. Its color was dark gray, and it made a noise similar to an electric generator. Turning on and off. So when you turn on an electric generator, turning on, it turns on and off, on and off, on. It makes that dum sound. So he heard it. The witnesses say they heard this sound produced by this rounded, flattened, dark gray object. Another case, which happened the following month on June 25th, 1968, took place in a city called Guarujá. But it's not the Guarujá in São Paulo, it's the Guarujá in Rio Grande do Sul, near Porto Alegre. And the information was written down, it was detailed. Let's put it this way, in a bulletin from Gipovni, which was another group also from Rio Grande do Sul that did research. And it says here that it was from 6:30 post-meridium to 7 o'clock post-meridium. A globe-shaped object was seen, which was very bright on consecutive days. So it was appearing there for several days and its movement was irregular. Sometimes it would stop in the air, change color from red to orange, and make a noise. When it moved quickly through the air in the sky there, it made a very loud noise, according to the witnesses. Another case happened in August, on August 5, 1968, in the city of Linz, in the state of São Paulo, in the countryside of São Paulo. It says here that the object made a kind of rumbling sound. Its noise was like a rumble, something like that. It's even written in quotes, "Ron, Ron, 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 Ron," and as if it was failing, like an engine, failing like that. This case was reported in a newspaper from Rio de Janeiro in its September 18, 1968 edition. And it was also published in Diário da Noite, which is a newspaper from São Paulo, in its August 27, 1968 edition. So they say here that in the Junqueira neighborhood there in Linz, Mrs. Italia, she told her husband. Aurelio Gallo is also a very famous case. This case of Aurelio Gallo was even investigated by Center for Investigation of Unidentified Aerial Objects by the Brazilian Air Force, the Center for Investigation of Unidentified Aerial Objects, the Aurelio Gallo case. Very interesting, from Linz. And she told him, look at that funny device, that weird device. It was a circular-shaped object surrounded by a strong glow, kind of mirrored, according to her. And in the center, at the base, there was an opaque yellow circle with a checkered pattern. So the bottom part was kind of checkered. This object here is really interesting. I had never heard of an object with these characteristics, with the bottom part of the object looking like a checkered chessboard. Yeah. And she said it had two spurs, according to her, which were two antennas. So the object had that checkered part underneath and two antennas. And it was seen by her and her husband. And it made this noise with the sound of a small rumble. And she said it flew kind of wobbling. Let's see. Here, she said. And there's a drawing that was made by Mr. Gallo and by the researchers Jorge Gennari and the engineer Augusto Masaya Katsuda from Arasatuba. At the time, they were affiliated with a group that no longer exists, also called Sipoania, which was the Center for Investigation and Research of Unidentified Aerial Objects of Arasatuba. And they also gave testimony to a society that had a ufology group, which at the time was presided over by Professor Flavio Pereira. We even posted a video recently with Goulart de Andrade interviewing Flavio Pereira. So they also gave testimony to Professor Flavio Pereira, who wrote the book, The Red Book of the Researchers, a thick book about this size. So that was the case. What happened in Linz also had that strange noise. So it's quite likely that I might have that Sean folder. Later, I'll even look for the one from Aurelio Gallo, since he actually gave a statement to the Air Force military in 1968. That's when they started collecting several cars there in Linz, in the countryside of São Paulo, in Presidente Prudente, Marília, Bauru, Pirassununga, where the Air Force kept investigating, and then they continued these investigations, intensifying them in 1969. So Zane himself, when I was at his apartment, he told me that there were only a few cases, but there were some there that had buzzing, that had noise. It was some hissing, something that happened from time to time, but in most cases, they were silent objects. Well, in 69, on February 22nd, 1969, in São José dos, I think that's wrong. Here in the written report, it says São José dos Pinheiros, but it should be São José dos Pinhais. Curitiba, which is a city that's right there. And in the past, São José dos Pinhais used to belong to Curitiba. And this is from 69. So it's probably written incorrectly here in the report. They put São José dos Pinheiros here and this one here. It's a news article that came out in a newspaper called A Notícia from Rio de Janeiro in its February 22nd, 69 edition. So it says that the baker and owner of the bakery, Inácio Grossman, woke up to a strange noise, a noise that sounded like a truck. And then he saw an object 50 meters from where he was. It was orange. The object had a rounded shape and it was rising vertically. And then it started to release a white smoke from the bottom and disappeared in a few seconds. It disappeared and then there was no more noise. It says here that it was already completely silent. Everything was calm there. So sometimes it makes noise, sometimes it doesn't. There is another case also happened in 69 already in the month of March 69, which says here 23, actually March, no, it was published in March in the newspaper O Dia from Rio de Janeiro on March 2nd and on March 4th. A report mentioning several sightings, but the sighting that interests us is about a minor whose initials are here, because since he was a minor, in the report, they only put the initials RC. He lived on Capitão Edmundo Soares Street, and he reported that on Sunday. On February 23rd, 1969, while he was bathing in a waterfall up in the mountains with a friend, they heard a faint noise. When they looked back, they saw a huge object from which, through a vertical door, two beings came out. Two men there, small in stature, two short men, had human features, a greenish tone on their heads, and their chests had a phosphorescent glow, being grayish from the waist down, as if they were wearing a more grayish outfit from the waist down. The boys ran down Serra Baixa and then came back with two guards, but they didn't see anything else at that place. This happened in Nova Iguaçu in Rio de Janeiro, so they saw it, got very scared, looked for some guards there and took them to the place. We saw an object like this making a noise. Two little men came down and they took the guards there, but when they arrived, there was nothing there anymore. Another case from 69 was in Santa Barbara in Sao Paulo, in the countryside of Sao Paulo, also published in the newspaper O Dia, which is a newspaper from Rio de Janeiro, also from Minas Gerais, actually from Rio de Janeiro, in its June 13th, 1969 edition. The case also happened in 69. And it says here that Mrs. Mercezinha Simonini saw an intense violet light through her window. Then her husband went to take a closer look and saw it. An elliptical object about 5 meters in diameter with multicolored lights of various colors, emitting a strange noise and interfering with the television's operation. When he tried to get closer, in this case, the husband tried to approach, the object simply disappeared, vanished, and he didn't see where it went. That's what happened in the countryside of Sao Paulo, Santa Barbara. And this one is interesting because it also interfered with the television set. I'm going to tell you one from the 1970s now, then I'll jump to the year 2000 so we can talk about another case. 1970s, I'll just talk about one case. There are several here. Sete Lagoas in Minas Gerais. Again, Minas Gerais. There are quite a few objects with sounds like that. In Minas Gerais, at least several cases have been recorded. This happened on November 24, 1970 in the city of Sete Lagoas, Minas Gerais. And what about Mrs. Marta Gonzalez Silveira? She was woken up around 3 in the morning by the sound of her sons crying. So she went there to help, that sort of thing. And she also noticed a light coming through the window. So she looked and wondered, what's that outside? At 3 in the morning, as she looked, she saw a flying saucer suspended in the air. So there was an unidentified flying object, a flying saucer floating there, about 6 meters in diameter, circling around the rings. So about the disc, she mentioned several shades like a rainbow. So there were many colors there, according to her description. Then the disc rose, making a very low noise, that kind of soft noise that people sometimes talk about. And when the lights around it started spinning quickly, that's when it flew faster and disappeared. The device left part of the lawn burned, which means it had landed. When she saw it, it was already hovering, but there was a burned spot left on the lawn. In other words, a close encounter of the second kind with a physical mark. On the ground, she said there was a strong smell of carbon ozone, a burnt smell. And this was still verified the next day by hundreds of people who went to the site after they heard about the story. As it was published in the newspaper O Dia, here, Correio, which is the newspaper from Brazil, November 26, from 1970. So there were a lot of curious people there wanting to see what it was, what had happened, and so on. They probably took pictures of this thing. I don't know if it made it into the newspapers. I'll even try to see if I can find this newspaper to check out the news, but not all the news. In the past, they used to publish some kind of image, a photograph of the place, but if there is one, it's an interesting thing, good. Now, I wanted to move on to a last case involving, because at this point you can see that there are cases, yes. Over several decades, every now and then, the unidentified flying object produces some kind of noise or sound. And this case happened on December 13, 2000, also in Minas Gerais, in the city of Turama. It's a well-known case, which is an abduction of a family. John Kayana and his family ended up being abducted. His case is quite well known. There are plenty of videos out there on the internet, on our channel. I don't think we have this case yet, but on the internet, you'll find several news reports, even on television from the press, interviewing the couple because they were seen there by several people, including the couple's daughter. And this case, here I'll say who was there. João Caiana was involved at the time in December 2000 at 50 years old. At that time, in the year 2000, his wife, Valdera Santos, who was 44 years old, was there. His daughter, Maggie Aparecida, who was 21 years old, and his granddaughter, Lavinia, who was 4 years old. A friend named Nide was also there. So there were 5 people inside a Beetle, and they were driving along a rural dirt road. They were inside the little Beetle, a white Beetle, license plate GLS 0302. And at night, according to him, the sky was very clear and the weather was warm. December is usually a very hot time there in the Triangulo Mineiro in Iturama. And then at a certain moment, he stopped the car and observed an object above the treetops at a distance of approximately 150 meters. The object spotted by the witnesses was about 20 meters in diameter. It was very bright, had a visible dome and 2 distinct yellow lights, one on the left side and a red one on the right side. And according to the witness, the object emitted a faint buzzing sound while those lights blinked and the object moved. He said that the Beetle started to get hot. It started to get really hot. The ambient temperature was rising and everyone started to sweat a lot. Then at that moment, Maggie, the daughter, saw a grayish being, that gray type, thin, with an angular head, apparently without ears like we have, a thin nose, and the eyes were also large like the gray type, right? And then it approached the car, right? And from that point on, the abduction happened, right? Of them. And so if people look it up on the internet, they'll find out everything that happened. He even gave interviews and took part in events telling about his abduction experience, right? The relatives there. He always said that something happened, right? And we are convinced that something must have happened. Although today, nowadays, after he appeared on several television shows, there might have been some influence. That sometimes happens even with the abductee, right? With people. And then you start interpreting a lot of things, sometimes even incorrectly, right? But then the influence of some ufologists who sometimes don't even know what they're researching, don't really understand it very well. Or they have some mixed up ideas about this subject, right? And then they end up giving an explanation to the abductee. Then the abductee takes that as the truth and starts spreading it around. Then the case starts to take on a kind of weird proportion, right? But like, I don't suspect that he or the family is lying, especially because there was a lot of evidence there that in fact they went through an abduction. But you know, over time, the case gets a little contaminated, right? All the cases, if we look at abductions, they end up like that. And in this case of John Caiana, right, from the Caiana family, which happened in Iturama, we also had the presence of the sound, right? The buzzing while that ship, that unidentified flying object was there, right? Moving, the lights flashing. Okay, so they heard, right, this kind of buzzing, right? A noise probably produced there by the object, by its technology, or by the electromagnetic field. We don't know what makes the object produce this kind of sound at certain times, and at other times there's no sound at all. But this live stream, like I said at the beginning, its main goal is to be more instructive, you know, to guide you, showing you that it might happen, but it also might not. In most cases, there's no sound, but every now and then there is some kind of sound So yeah, that would be it, right? And I also wanted you to share your thoughts there. If you've ever seen an unidentified flying object, leave it in the descriptions, make a comment. If you've ever seen an unidentified flying object that made a sound, right? So let us know so we can find out, right? Oh, there are also more cases happening nowadays, right? I know that at least up until 2 years ago, in 2012, I know at least some cases where there was noise, right? In Brazil. I'm talking now about abroad up until 2024. There are reports. If you look for them, you'll find some from 2025. I don't know yet if any reports have come up, anything like that. But 2024, there definitely are. So it's something that's part of the technology, of the movement there, of the unidentified flying object. And every now and then, the witness will experience that. It would be interesting to try to record it, right? And then just leave it at that. Do you know anyone who has ever recorded something like that? Or who has it, who could send it to us here so we could try to analyze it? Because the more famous cases of this sound are from abroad, right? That one from Spain, which happened in Logroño with Javier Bosque in 1972, about the object that entered his room when he was a seminarian. There's that case from the United States from 1981. There's a sound from an object in Switzerland in the 70s recorded by that Billy Meyer, right? But then it's already a kind of complicated sound. We don't know if it could have been fake or not, right? So it's a bit of a suspicious sound. The most reliable ones are the one from 1981, the one from 1972 in Spain, in Logroño. And here in Brazil, there was the one from Maranhão. But we also get a bit unsure, right, when it comes to recordings. Now, I know that the military does have this, right? It's rarer and all, but they have it because they've already told me they do, yes.